CCENT journey with me, Ryan. In this next section, we're going to continue with the VLANs, focusing on the DTP, the Dynamic Trunking Protocol. For those who don't know, you can contact me here on YouTube, on LinkedIn, or Twitter. So first of all, what is the Dynamic Trunking Protocol? The Dynamic Trunking Protocol, DTP, is used to negotiate between switches to either come up with an access port or a trunk port. In the previous video, we'd said that access ports were primarily downstream towards end clients and trunk ports were between switches. Now, we looked at actually how to configure both access and trunk ports, but they were done statically using the switch port mode trunk and, if needed, the switch port trunk encapsulation .1q. As for access ports, they were done using the switch port mode access and then assigned against a single VLAN using the switch port access VLAN followed by the VLAN ID. In this video, we're going to dive a bit deeper into trunking and into VLANs in general, talking about the Dynamic Trunking Protocol. So what do we have to know about DTP? First of all, DTP is Cisco proprietary. Cisco proprietary means that it only runs between Cisco devices. If on your network you've got a switch connecting to another vendor and it sends out DTP messages, then it won't get a response back in. It's also recommended, if you're having this type of setup, to turn DTP off between switches on different vendors, because normally other vendors have another protocol similar to DTP, but obviously it will be proprietary to them to negotiate trunks between their switches. And it's certainly best practice that you turn off the negotiation to another vendor switch, because the last thing you want is some confusion there, or for the Cisco to try to interpret the information being sent back and forth. So DTP is on by default. So when you get your switch and you take it out of the box, previously we said that everything was in VLAN 1. Well, also every switch port is configured with DTP. Now, the mode of which DTP is configured, which we'll come on to in a moment, will vary from switch model to switch model. Now, the reason it's important to know that DTP is enabled by default is because if you were to plug two switches together, like so, 9 out of 10 times they will be able to form some kind of trunk with one another, and that may or may not be your intentions. And the reason you may not want to form a trunk with another switch is because when you form another switch, a trunk with another switch, you then start negotiating the VLAN trunking protocol and start influencing things like the spanning tree protocol. So that may be an undesirable effect. So make sure that if you're plugging two switches together and you don't want them to yet form a trunk, then turn off DTP, or better yet, shut down the port until you need it. The other reason you need to be aware that is on by default is, remember what else plugs into our switches. If it's at the access layer, we have end stations, we have clients. The last thing we want is someone trying to do some malicious attack by plugging in a PC and sending DTP frames into the switch to try and negotiate a trunk in order to get a view of the layer 2 domain. So turn off DTP down to the end clients. And when we come on to the different DTP modes in a moment, you'll start to see why and how DTP helps to combat that. Depending on the switch make and model, the encapsulation method is normally ISL by default. However, I have a comment here regarding the new CCENT, because the syllabus doesn't mention ISL, it only mentions the .1q standard, which is the open standard from the IEEE. So it's most likely to be aware that there is a default encapsulation method, on older switches, maybe switches that you're going to buy off eBay to simulate in your lab, or maybe your version of packet tracer, you're going to notice that DTP will by default try to form an ISL trunk, which was the Cisco proprietary trunking protocol, rather than the open standard .1Q. But like I said, let's be aware that on the new CCENT, ISL is not a topic, it's only .1Q. It's important that when we talk about the DTP protocol, we understand the difference between the administrative mode and the operational mode. Now, this was something that we looked at in our previous video. We said the admin mode was something that the administrator actually configured on the CLI, and the output of the configuration mode is what's referred to as the operational mode. So if I actually manually configured the port to be a trunk, then I would expect the operational mode to also become a trunk. The reason it's important to know the difference between these is because if the administrator has used, let's say, dynamic auto, which is a DTP mode, the operational effect of that may result in the port going to access rather than going to trunk. And this is why DTP is confusing to some, because they forget what needs to be configured at each end in order to form a trunk, and which combination of modes actually achieve the goal they want. DTP carries VTP. Now, VTP is the VLAN trunking protocol, and it's something that we've not spoken about yet, and it is something that we're going to cover in later videos. But a quick overview of what VTP is, so it makes a bit more sense. Let's say we have a couple of switches, let's say all four of these switches, and they're all connected with trunks between one another. Now, in the previous video, I said that when we go on to the CLI and we create a VLAN, we go onto global config and we give it, let's say, VLAN ID 10, and maybe we give it a name of test. I said you need to go onto each switch and also configure that VLAN to exist, because we want that VLAN to extend across multiple switches, as we want to create a broadcast domain across all of these switches. So if we had a PC over here in VLAN 10 and a PC over here in VLAN 10, if a broadcast packet, let's say an ARP request, is sent on the wire, we want it to be sent across the trunks to the switch and then down to the end client. Well, if you can imagine, if we had 30-40 switches inside our layer 2 domain, going on each switch and ensuring that VLAN exists can be very time consuming. So VTP, the VLAN trunking protocol, allows you to synchronize a database between the switches. So on this particular switch, if I log onto it and I create VLAN 50, a VTP message is sent to all the other switches that are listening for it, and they too will create VLAN 50. I won't assign the VLAN to the ports, but it will create the actual VLAN itself, which in turn will create the MAC address table for that VLAN, allowing it to send and receive frames, and it will also start the spanning tree instance for that VLAN. So as I said, VTP is something we'll get onto a bit later, but we need to be aware that it is carried inside DTP messages. And the reason that's important is because if we have a VTP domain over here, and let's say we called that domain A, and we have a VTP domain over here called B, and we plug these two switches together, when those DTP frames are sent out, if the VTP domain is not the same, then DTP will fail and not form a trunk. So something that we need to be aware of through this DTP section, but something that we will actually get some hands on and discuss further, which is the VTP element of it. But ultimately, VTP is an administrative protocol that allows us to save time by deploying a VLAN on one particular switch and allowing it to be sent to all other switches inside that layer 2 domain. Lastly, when it comes to DTP, we're going to come across these things called modes, and these are configurations that you can put on either side of the switch on a cable, so here and here, and depending on what you put on each side depends on the output of DTP. So like I said, if we do, let's say, the dynamic auto, which is a particular mode on one side, and we hard set using the switch port mode trunk on the other, then the output is it will become a trunk. If on this side we also have it as dynamic auto, then the output is it won't form a trunk, it will probably become an access port. And it's important that you understand the combination of these modes and the output they produce, and we'll go onto a switch and we'll play with those modes and we'll see what we're able to produce. So what modes do we have with DTP? The first mode is the access mode. Now, I said in the videos up to now that access ports are normally downstream towards clients. So we have our switch and we have a bunch of downstream switches, downstream clients all plugged into this switch. We said that these will be part of a single VLAN, and in turn this single VLAN is considered an access port. But it is possible for links between switches to also become access and not trunk. Now, in a real design, there's no real benefit of doing that, but you need to be aware that it is certainly possible. So access is an output that could happen from a DTP negotiation. So if we don't force the negotiation to be a trunk actively, then it could fall back to access. But access ports are single VLANs. Now, what you can also do to influence DTP is, in the previous video we talked about switch port, mode, access, and we said that this is the sort of command that you would put on these ports going downstream to the PC. Well, when you apply that to the port, it actually turns off the DTP negotiation, and it prevents DTP packets from being sent and received on the port. So again, it adds that security by ensuring that access ports, which tend to go down to end clients, can negotiate DTP and get a view of the network by forming a trunk. Moving on to the next mode is the actual hard set of a trunk itself. So we had two switches. We would go onto the port, and just like we did in our previous video, we done switch port, mode, trunk, and then if required, we done the switch port, trunk, encapsulation, .1Q. Now, setting this as a trunk on one of these sides or both, it does not turn off DTP. So unlike our access ports, when we configure it on the actual port itself, manually configuring it by stating what we want that port to be. When we do it with access, DTP is turned off. When we do it as trunk, DTP remains on. Now the other thing, just for completion, what I've said up to now to help you understand trunks is I said trunks are normally formed between switches, which they are, and I said downstream to clients they're normally access, which they also are. However, it is possible to have a trunk to a server or a PC. Now, to a PC, unless you're doing some capturing or something, there's no real reason to do that, but it can be done. But of course, the NIC card on the PC needs to be able to support the tagging, because remember, when the frames go between switches over a trunk, they insert that tag, as previously explained in the last video. The reason you do it to a server is because if this server is a VM machine, let's say it's an EXI box, and inside that EXI box there's multiple servers, then what you tend to do is push a trunk down to the server itself and have each PC inside a different VLAN. Now the reason I'm highlighting this now is because in the previous video that was something we didn't go into, because I didn't want to add confusion to trunks and access ports. But it's important that you understand that trunks and access ports, even though 9 out of 10 times they're assigned where they should be assigned, i.e. access to clients and trunks to switches, it is possible to do the opposite. The only thing you need to keep in mind when we're configuring these is access ports mean a single VLAN, trunk ports means multiple VLANs. But when we do trunk ports, because there's multiple VLANs, we add a tag. And because we add this .1q tag, we need the end device, whether it's a switch, server or client, to be able to interpret that tag on the layer 2 frame. So something a little bit off track there, but it's very important that we touch base and we understand it during our VLAN conversations, and DTP is a good place to bring that up now from the previous video, understanding VLANs and trunks and access ports in more detail. So DTP, so far we can set it statically on access, statically through trunks, both of which we've seen in the previous video, but we didn't see how that affected DTP. Number 3, we have the option of a dynamic auto. Now dynamic auto is, instead of going onto the port and doing switchport mode trunk, switchport mode access, we simply go under and say switchport mode dynamic auto. And this passively being a key word that you need to remember, passively accepts DTP packets. So what I mean by passively is if you have 2 switches connected together, both are configured with dynamic auto, it will not form a trunk because it's passively listening. It's not sending DTP messages. So when we set it as a hard trunk, it was sending DTP messages. But when we set it as dynamic auto, it's not sending DTP messages. It's only passively listening to them. And if it doesn't receive the DTP messages, then it will actually prefer to actually become an access port. Now the opposite of dynamic auto is dynamic desirable. And desirable has the key word there of active. So instead of passive, we have this thing called active, and it actively sends DTP packets. So it will try to become a trunk. So again, if we had our 2 switches and we had a cable between these 2 switches, one side was set up as auto, the other side was set up as desirable. When the DTP packets are sent from this side, the auto switch will accept it and they will agree to become a trunk. Same is true if both of them were desirable. If they're desirable, both of them will send out DTP packets and both of them will agree to become a trunk. If we didn't have auto and desirable at one side and we actually hard set it as a trunk, then DTP messages are still sent on trunks as previously explained, so they would also agree to become a trunk. If we had a trunk at one side manually set and we had dynamic auto at another, because trunk sends DTP, the output would be it becomes a trunk. So this is why I keep going back to understanding that clients do not send DTP, to ensure that you understand that trunks do send DTP. Dynamic auto only listens to DTP. Dynamic desirable actively sends DTP, because depending on the combination of these depends on your output. Do you actually obtain an access port or do you obtain a trunk port? Our last option is to actually perform the no negotiate or non-negotiate on the switch port to turn off the DTP messages. Previously, I explained that the access ports, when configured downstream towards the clients, DTP is off, but when we configure the trunk ports, DTP is on. So in order to have a few benefits of actually turning off the negotiation, which include the security, which lowers the overhead, and what I mean by overhead is DTP packets are not sent, so it's less bandwidth, even though it's minuscule, it's something to keep in mind. And because we've actually hard set the trunks, it's just pointless sending out DTP messages providing both sides agree on it. So to highlight the actual combinations to form trunks and not to form trunks, we have, if you have it statically set for trunks on both sides, it will form a trunk. If you have it desirable on one side, desirable on the other side, it will form a trunk. If you have it desirable on one side and trunk, or in this case on, it will form a trunk. If you have desirable and auto, it will form a trunk. And if you have trunk / on or auto, it will form a trunk. So things that won't work is if you have it auto and auto, that won't work. Obviously, if you set it to access manually on one side, that won't work. So you just need to be aware of the different behaviors for the different DTP modes, and a good way to do that is to get stuck in to the CLI and actually configure it yourself using Packet Tracer, or even better, some physical switches that you pick up. So we covered quite a lot on this video. We had a good overview of the DTP. We said that this was a Cisco proprietary method to negotiate trunking on a switch. We talked about the difference between the administrative mode and the operational mode. We looked at the different modes themselves. So we had a discussion around the different types of dynamic modes, both desirable and auto, and how to configure the trunk on manually, and when DTP is turned off, whether you use the switch port mode access or whether you use the non-negotiate. We had a very brief overview of VTP, the VLAN trunking protocol, and how that allows us to propagate VLAN that we create on one switch to the rest of the switches inside our domain. and how that affects the DTP negotiation when trying to form trunking. The main takeaway from this is to ensure that you really understand trunking, that it means multiple, and it can be between switches, PCs, servers, whatever you want it to be, providing that the remote device supports it. But 9 out of 10 times, trunking is only between switches. We talked about access, which means single. This can be between switches, depending on your DTP configuration, or if you manually set it to be so. But it's normally access is a single VLAN downstream towards your PCs. It's important that you understand why we have DTP and the default behavior of DTP, how to modify DTP, which we're going to get into in our next couple of videos, and how the different modes affect DTP. So if you have auto at both sides, why doesn't that actually form a trunk? Lastly, I want to thank you for viewing, and I hope this has been helpful, and if it has been, please do like and subscribe.